So today we are diving deep into that idea of a military turning point. Not just a battle, but a single event that just completely shatters an empire.
Right. And when you talk about Napoleon, everyone's mind immediately goes to Waterloo.
Of course.
But the real death blow, the moment the end became inevitable, that actually came almost 2 years earlier.
That's what we're zeroing in on today. A battle that is often, I think, overlooked in popular history, but is absolutely critical.
It is. We're talking about the Battle of Leipzig, and our mission for this deep dive is to really understand why this battle, which was known as the Battle of the Nations, why this was the event that truly broke Napoleon.
And just to set the stage, let's start with the scale of it, because the numbers here are almost unbelievable.
They really are. This was, hands down, the largest single battle of the entire Napoleonic Wars.
By a lot, right?
Oh, by a huge margin. You've got nearly 560,000 soldiers all converging on one location. Think about that for a second. Mobilizing 500,000 men in that era to fight for 4 straight days near Leipzig was, well, it was almost unimaginable.
Okay, so let's start there with that name, the Battle of the Nations. It sounds so epic, almost mythological.
It does, but it's a very literal title. It earned that name simply because of the sheer number of flags on the field. For years, Napoleon had been the master of, picking his enemies off one by one.
Beating the Austrians, then turning to fight the Prussians.
Exactly. Leipzig was the moment they all finally stood together and said, no more.
So who exactly made up this giant coalition? This wasn't just a simple alliance.
No, not at all. You had the major powers of Austria, Prussia, Russia, and even Sweden.
And getting that group to work together, that was a huge diplomatic challenge in itself.
It was notoriously difficult. These were nations that were often rivals, but the threat Napoleon posed, well, it finally forced them to put those old tensions aside.
And that unity led to the key difference here, which was the numbers. They didn't just unite, they brought overwhelming force.
That's the brutal math of it. Napoleon, he still had a massive army, maybe 185,000 troops.
Which would normally be a winning force?
On any other day, yes. But the coalition just buried him in manpower. They fielded something like 320,000 troops.
So nearly a 2-to-1 advantage.
A huge advantage. It meant Napoleon was surrounded, fighting a war of attrition on multiple fronts at the same time. He was just being ground down.
And that kind of coordination must have taken more than just a treaty. You need generals on the ground who actually trust each other.
Absolutely. And that's where figures like the Prussian Field Marshal von Blücher come in, or the Austrian Field Marshal von Schwarzenberg, who was the overall commander. Their ability to keep these massive multinational armies moving as one was really the secret to the victory.
So we have this massive crash, 4 days in October 1813 near Leipzig. And you mentioned it sets a kind of benchmark.
It really does. To find a bigger battle in Europe, you have to jump forward more than 100 years to World War I.
100 years.
For a century, no single battle involved more soldiers or more nations. It just speaks to the sheer desperation of the moment.
So let's move past the scale and get to the result, because a loss this big wasn't just about losing soldiers, was it?
No, this was the decisive blow. The immediate outcome was a severe, unambiguous defeat for Napoleon. This wasn't a strategic withdrawal.
It was a rout.
It was a rout, and the human cost is just chilling. Combined casualties for both sides were over 100,000 men.
100,000 soldiers in 4 days. You have to let that number sink in.
You do. People always talk about the disastrous retreat from Russia the year before.
Which was a long, slow disaster.
Exactly. Russia was a slow bleed. Leipzig was like a sudden, massive arterial burst. His army was already strained, full of young conscripts. Losing another, say, 30 or 40,000 killed and wounded, plus tens of thousands captured.
He just couldn't replace them.
He couldn't. It completely wiped out his ability to launch another major offensive.
But I'd argue the real damage, the thing he truly lost, wasn't counted in soldiers. It was about confidence. This is where that aura of invincibility gets shattered.
That's the ultimate takeaway from this battle. For almost 20 years, Napoleon's power had been built on this idea that he was unbeatable.
His own soldiers believed it. His enemies feared it.
Right. That aura was his primary political weapon. Leipzig, fought on German soil with all of Europe watching, just publicly destroyed that myth.
And once that psychological shield is gone,
the whole empire becomes fragile, structurally unsound.
So what did that mean on the ground? What was the immediate strategic consequence of losing that aura?
It was immediate, and it was devastating. Napoleon was forced into a massive retreat, scrambling to get what was left of his army back behind the Rhine River.
Which means he's abandoning all of Germany.
Instantly, his control over Central Europe was just gone. Over.
And that's not just a redrawing of the map. Retreating behind the Rhine means the war is now coming to France itself.
Precisely. For the first time in a very long time, he was no longer the conqueror. He was suddenly a desperate defender of his own borders.
And that chaotic retreat, that brings us to what might be the most, unbelievable detail of this whole thing. Because a disaster of this size is almost always made worse by a huge internal mistake.
It is. And the retreat from Leipzig has a world-class example of that. The defeat was already catastrophic. But the way the retreat was managed turned it into a total nightmare.
And it all comes down to a single bridge.
The Elster River Bridge. It was the only major escape route for a huge portion of the French army, especially the rear guard.
So the plan was to get everyone across and then blow the bridge to slow down the Allies. A standard tactic.
A sound plan. But the execution...
The timing went wrong.
It went catastrophically wrong.
Yeah.
In the absolute chaos of the retreat, with the Allies pressing in, a single corporal detonated the charges too early.
A single corporal. On his own.
Well, the orders were unclear, or he panicked, but the result was the same. The bridge was gone.
And thousands of French troops were still on the other side.
Thousands. Some estimates say over 20,000 men were trapped.
What happened to them?
They were forced to surrender en masse. Or they tried to swim the river, and many drowned. It was a complete disaster within a disaster.
That one detail, the bridge, it just perfectly shows how the French command structure had completely broken down.
It does. The discipline, the command and control that defined the Grande Armée, it was just gone, replaced by panic.
It's basically self-sabotage on an epic scale.
It really is. It turned a bad loss into an empire-ending catastrophe.
So let's look at that final domino effect. How did Leipzig directly lead to the end of the empire?
Well, the momentum the coalition gained was just unstoppable. After a victory that big, they had the confidence to push all the way. The defeat at Leipzig led directly to the invasion of France itself only a few months later.
And once they crossed the Rhine and marched on Paris, it was all over.
That's right. The battle led directly to Napoleon's forced abdication in 1814. Waterloo, which came later, was really just the epilogue. Leipzig was the end of the story.
And beyond Napoleon himself, the battle reshaped the entire continent.
Oh, absolutely. The collapse of French power in Germany and Poland was huge. But the bigger legacy was that it ended this long era of one nation trying to dominate the entire continent.
And it paved the way for what came next. The restoration of a so-called balance of power in Europe.
Exactly. It set the stage for the Congress of Vienna, where the great powers basically sat down to create a new system. A system designed specifically to prevent another Napoleon, another continent-wide war.
So you're trying to make sense of this whole deep dive. I think the biggest takeaway for me is just the power of unity. This coalition finally overwhelmed a single figure who had always won by keeping his enemies divided.
I agree completely, and it's a powerful lesson, about how fragile even the strongest empires can be. When that physical defeat is so total, and it's made worse by mistakes like that bridge, the aura of invincibility isn't just damaged.
It's broken, irreparably.
It's shattered.
And it really makes you think about how quickly a dominant empire can just crumble once that core psychological advantage is gone. The Battle of the Nations didn't just end the war. It created this huge political vacuum, and the victorious nations then spent the next 100 years trying to fill it, right up until the First World War. Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're looking at something that feels, inevitable once you see all the pieces.
It really does.
We are diving into the Battle of Leipzig in 1813. The Battle of the Nations. And if you look at the source material, this was not some sudden clash.
No.
This was the crushing, completely predictable collision that came after a whole series of just catastrophic missteps.
All stemming from one man, really. Napoleon Bonaparte.
Exactly. So our mission today is clear. We are going to unpack these sources and trace that specific chain of causes. How did it all lead to his first, and I think more importantly, his irreversible defeat on German soil?
That's the key word, isn't it? Irreversible.
Yeah. How does a man at the absolute peak of his power in, say, 1811, find himself completely crushed just 2 years later?
It's the perfect question, because the sources show that Leipzig itself, the battle, it was really just the final symptom.
A symptom of a bigger disease.
Exactly. You're not looking at a general making one bad call on the field. You are tracing the total collapse of his entire strategic and diplomatic framework.
So where do we start?
To really get why Leipzig happened, we have to go back to its roots. And that means we start in the snow and the mud of 1812.
Okay, let's do it. The foundational disaster. The 1812 Russian campaign. And for you listening, I really want you to try and visualize the scale of this.
It's hard to overstate.
Right. Just saying Napoleon lost in Russia doesn't even begin to cover it. This was the annihilation of his most critical resource.
His veteran soldiers.
His veteran manpower. The sources all confirm this wasn't just a retreat. It was a trauma that, it decimated the Grande Armée. Hundreds of thousands of men lost. But it's the kind of loss that matters here, isn't it?
That's the crucial insight. It's not just the numbers, it's the specialization of the men he lost. What's fascinating is how the disaster just crippled his cavalry, the mounted arm of his forces.
All the scouts.
All the scouts. His elite, experienced horsemen and their horses. They just weren't equipped for the Russian winter. They froze. They starved.
So what does that mean for the next year, for 1813?
It means he was fighting strategically blind.
Blind. Okay.
Think about it. Reconnaissance, the eyes and ears of your army, that's all cavalry. Without them, Napoleon couldn't scout enemy movements. He couldn't gauge their numbers. He couldn't confirm where they were. He was just guessing.
So he's just moving these huge blocks of infantry around without knowing what's ahead.
Exactly. Fighting deaf and dumb. And that intelligence failure in 1813 is a direct result of the losses in 1812.
Right.
It's a massive factor leading to Leipzig.
And that's just the cavalry. If that was the strategic crippling, what about the tactical side? The infantry?
Well, with all those veterans gone, who do you think he had to send into the field?
He had to be scraping the bottom of the barrel.
He was. He called up thousands of young, inexperienced conscripts. The sources call them the Marie Louises.
After the empress who signed the decree, right?
That's the one. And these were boys. They didn't have the training, the stamina, and crucially, the morale of the men lost in Russia.
So they couldn't march as far.
Couldn't march as far, couldn't maneuver as quickly, and they deserted at a much higher rate. It creates this paradox in 1813.
Which is?
On paper, Napoleon still has this huge army, but it's a brittle force. It just doesn't have the backbone to survive a drawn-out, multi-day meat grinder like Leipzig. And that weakness created a vacuum.
An opportunity.
An opportunity for everyone who was waiting for him to fail.
Okay, so that's the perfect transition. We move from the military collapse to the political reaction. This is where the dominoes really start to fall against him.
Because now his enemies can see he's vulnerable.
And the sources all point to this profound rise in German nationalism.
Yeah.
This wasn't just local grumbling anymore.
No, this is different.
It was an ideological awakening. A real push for a unified resistance among German states that had been under French rule for, a decade.
And that local unrest, that's the fuel for the fire?
Right. It provides the ideological glue. Historically, you have powers like Austria, Prussia, Russia. They could never agree on anything.
They were rivals, vying for influence against each other.
But Napoleon's heavy hand, plus the sight of him failing so spectacularly in Russia, that allowed them to finally set those rivalries aside.
For a moment, at least. And this leads directly to the formation of the Sixth Coalition in 1813. This wasn't just a temporary alliance.
This was the real deal.
A massive, deliberate union of Europe's major powers. You got Russia, Prussia, Austria, Sweden, all of them united against France. The scale was unprecedented.
And they didn't just shake hands on it, they put it down on paper, a formal pact.
Absolutely crucial. The political backbone here is the Treaty of Kalisz.
Signed between Russia and Prussia.
Right. They pledged mutual support. But the really important thing about this treaty and the agreements that followed was that it set up a unified command, a shared goal.
Which was the liberation of German territories.
Precisely. It signals to Napoleon he isn't fighting separate armies anymore. He is facing one single coordinated military machine.
And that machine was big enough to actually implement a real strategy.
Yes. The Truchberg plan.
Which is brilliant in its simplicity.
It is. The plan was basically avoid fighting Napoleon himself, go after his marshals instead, target his subordinate forces,
wear down his new fragile army,
and just keep chipping away until their numbers gave them an overwhelming advantage. You can only do that with a unified purpose, which the coalition finally had.
Okay, and this is where it gets really interesting for me, because we pivot now to Napoleon's personal role in all this. He could have seen the writing on the wall.
You'd think so.
After Russia, the coalition actually gave him an out, a sort of off-ramp. So the big question is, why did he drive straight toward Leipzig?
His own political miscalculation. He just flat out rejected the peace offers that were on the table in 1813.
And these weren't offers of total surrender.
Not at all. This is arguably the biggest non-military cause of the battle. The offers, brokered by Austria, would have reduced French territory, pulled him out of Poland, parts of Germany.
But, and this is the key part, he would have kept his throne.
He would have remained Emperor of France, which raises the question, right? Why would a pragmatic leader with a shattered army facing a massive coalition refuse a deal that lets him stay in power?
It has to be ego.
It's a lethal cocktail of ego, and I think a political belief that any compromise would signal weakness.
And inspire more rebellion.
Yes. For Napoleon, being a reduced emperor was the same as being a defeated one. He just couldn't stomach the loss of prestige.
So by rejecting a deal that kept his title, he was basically guaranteeing this would be a fight to the finish.
He sealed his own fate. He made it clear to the coalition that diplomacy was pointless and that they would have to seek total victory.
And total victory meant cornering him.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Their resolve hardened. They knew they wouldn't stop until he was trapped. And that brings us right to the final squeeze just before the battle.
The final factors that sealed his fate in Germany. Because it wasn't just new enemies showing up. His own allies were abandoning him.
His whole support structure was crumbling from within.
Let's talk about the Confederation of the Rhine. When states like Bavaria and Saxony defected, what did that mean beyond just losing a few soldiers?
Oh, it was devastating. That internal erosion was key. These German states had been fighting for Napoleon.
They were providing troops, supplies.
Vital auxiliary troops, garrisons, and most importantly, logistical control. When they defected, Napoleon didn't just lose soldiers. He lost his logistical base.
The supply depots, the secure roads.
Everything. The ground literally shifted beneath his feet. Suddenly, his own allies were joining the enemy. It forced him to concentrate his depleted army around one single point.
Leipzig.
Because he couldn't move securely across the region anymore.
And while he's being boxed in, the coalition isn't just sitting around.
Not at all. They are aggressively pursuing the Trachenberg Plan with brutal efficiency. They're invading Saxony, they're coordinating their armies, and they're forcing him into a massive battle of annihilation.
On their terms.
On their terms, where his numerical inferiority would be absolutely fatal.
So let's synthesize this. Right before the battle, what's the board look like? We have a severely weakened French army.
Full of conscripts.
Blind, with no real reconnaissance.
Okay.
We have a unified, motivated, and massive coalition with a smart strategy.
A strategy designed to exploit his weaknesses, yep.
And we have Napoleon himself, who has refused any chance for peace, and whose local allies have all just abandoned him, wrecking his supply lines.
You put all of that together, and the outcome at Leipzig was, strategically speaking, it was a foregone conclusion.
It had to happen.
The Allied armies didn't just outnumber him, they vastly outnumbered him. Some sources say nearly 2-to-1. And they had superior cavalry and artillery.
So this wasn't just a battle he lost, it was the predictable end of a very bad year.
A year of military overreach, political hubris, and diplomatic failure. For you, the listener, the takeaway is pretty clear. The defeat at Leipzig was rooted in that interconnected collapse.
Army in Russia, failed diplomacy, unified coalition.
All three. It's a perfect case study of how a military disaster, when you add a dose of hubris, can just completely destroy your political reality.
And that leaves us with a final thought to mull over. Ponder for a moment how a single catastrophic failure of logistics and manpower in 1812,
That retreat from Moscow.
how that one event made years of dominance completely untenable just a few months later. It's a powerful reminder that even the most brilliant tactical genius can't defeat the combined forces of unified resistance and his own empty storehouses. So think about that irreversible defeat, and then ask yourself, how often does a leader today risk everything by doubling down on a failure, simply because they can't accept a slightly smaller version of success? Something to think about until our next deep dive.
Welcome to the Deep Dive, the place where we really get into the nuts and bolts of history. And today, we're looking at something just immense. The Battle of Leipzig, 1813.
Oh, it's monumental. People call it the Battle of the Nations for a reason.
Right.
It's the biggest battle in Europe before World War I. And it's what really, leads directly to Napoleon's first abdication.
And that scale is just mind-boggling. Over 500,000 men fighting for 4 days. But our mission today isn't so much the fighting itself.
Yeah.
It's the organization behind it. How on earth did four completely independent, often rival nations pull together a unified, winning army?
It's such a great question. Because if you look at the coalitions against France before 1813, they Well, they usually failed. They were slow. They couldn't agree on anything.
Just fall apart.
Exactly. But Leipzig was different. This time, I think the fear of Napoleon was finally big enough to make them work together.
Okay, so let's start with the players. Who are the core nations that made this alliance actually stick?
You're looking at the big three, plus one more. So it's Austria, Prussia, Russia, and Sweden.
Sweden.
That's the quad that provided the leadership and the sheer manpower to finally corner Napoleon in Germany.
4 powers, 4 agendas. So let's unpack the command structure first. It seems really layered, which tells you a lot about the politics involved.
It really does. And what's immediately striking is how high up the commitment went. This wasn't a case of monarchs staying home and letting their generals handle it.
No, they were actually there, right, near the battlefield.
Physically present, you have 3 reigning monarchs on the scene. Emperor Alexander I of Russia,
Okay.
King Frederick William III of Prussia, and Emperor Francis I of Austria. They are all there.
Wow. Which means decisions could be made fast, in theory, but I can also imagine the potential for arguments.
A massive potential for friction, absolutely. But it was also key to holding it all together. Before, if a general lost a battle, his king might just pull his troops out.
And the whole thing collapses.
Right. Here, they had to at least project this image of unity.
So with all that royal power in one place, who was actually in charge? Who was the supreme commander?
At the very top, the political and strategic command, that fell to Emperor Alexander I of Russia.
The Tsar.
Yeah. He was the ultimate authority for the whole coalition. It made sense.
Right.
Russia had just survived the 1812 invasion and was pouring troops into the fight. He was kind of the political big boss.
That works for the grand strategy. But, moving 500,000 men around Germany, reacting to Napoleon, that needs a dedicated military commander.
It does. And they understood that distinction.
So how did they solve that?
They made a really critical appointment. Austrian Field Marshal Karl Philipp, the Prince of Schwarzenberg.
Okay.
He was named commander-in-chief of all the coalition forces in the German theater. So you have this clear division of labor.
So Alexander says, our goal is to beat Napoleon and push him back to France.
Right. That's the what's.
And Schwarzenberg's job is the how. How do I use all these different armies to actually make that happen?
Precisely. And making him an Austrian was a very smart political move. Austria was a latecomer to the party, but brought a ton of resources.
So giving them the top military job helped keep them committed.
It balanced things out. So Alexander could handle the big picture politics, the egos of the other monarchs, while Schwarzenberg could focus on the maps and the troop movements.
But his job, wow. Coordinating troops who speak 4 different languages, who all have different ways of fighting. Were there standardized procedures for this?
A pipe dream, really.
Yeah.
The command language was French, which was pretty standard for European officers at the time.
The language of the enemy, ironically.
Right. But just imagine the staff work. An order comes down in French, and it has to be translated into German, into Russian. Mistakes were bound to happen.
And the different doctrines, too. The Austrians were known for being slow and methodical.
Very cautious. All about securing their supply lines. And then you have the Prussians, especially under Blücher, who are all about aggressive, fast attacks.
So how do you get those two to work together?
Schwarzenberg's whole strategy was built around that problem. He knew he couldn't get perfect timing, so the goal was just surround Napoleon. Use sheer numbers.
The hammer and anvil approach.
Exactly. Get all 4 armies to the Leipzig area at roughly the same time. That way, even if one is too fast or too slow, Napoleon is still trapped. Encirclement was the only goal that mattered.
That sets up the challenge perfectly. Okay, let's move from the command down to the actual armies on the field. They were split into 4 major groups to make that encirclement happen.
And you have to think of these as massive, almost self-sufficient forces, not just army corps.
Let's start with the biggest, the one directly under the commander-in-chief, the Army of Bohemia.
The Army of Bohemia was the powerhouse. We're talking about 225,000 men, commanded by Schwarzenberg himself.
250,000 men.
It's staggering. It was mainly Austrian, but with huge Russian and Prussian contingents mixed in. Their job was to be the main southern pincer.
And the logistical challenge of just feeding an army that size must have been why the Austrians were so cautious.
Absolutely. They moved slower because they had to. They needed massive amounts of food, forage for the horses. They couldn't risk the kind of starvation that hit Napoleon's army in Russia, but that methodical pace caused a lot of tension.
Which brings us to the fast guys, the Army of Silesia.
Yes, the Army of Silesia, smaller, about 95,000 troops, but incredibly aggressive.
And that was commanded by?
The Prussian Field Marshal, Gebhard von Blücher. This is a mixed Prussian and Russian force.
Ah, Blücher, Marshal forward.
Exactly. And that nickname tells you everything about the friction in the high command. Blücher just wanted to fight Napoleon head-on. He didn't have much patience for Schwarzenberg's careful plans.
So his job was to pressure from the northwest.
Right. But he was constantly threatening to just charge in on his own, which forced Schwarzenberg to keep adjusting the whole timetable to stop him from getting isolated.
So it's like Schwarzenberg is trying to conduct an orchestra, but his lead violinist keeps trying to play a high-speed solo.
That is a perfect way to put it.
Yeah.
And then you have the third major force, the Army of Poland.
Who was leading them?
A Russian general, Levin August von Bennigsen. His army was mostly a reserve and flanking force coming in from the east. He was crucial for closing the ring around Napoleon.
And within these huge armies, you had other really important commanders, right? It wasn't just a one-man show.
Oh, not at all. You had essential guys like the Russian general Mikhail Barclay de Tolly. He wasn't in charge of one of the main four armies, but he commanded the huge Russian part of the Army of Bohemia.
So he was basically making sure Schwarzenberg's Russian troops were integrated properly.
Yes, and on the Austrian side, you had commanders like Ignat Goulet leading huge corps. These were the men who turned the grand strategy into actual marching orders for hundreds of thousands of soldiers.
Okay, so that's three armies. But the fourth one, the Army of the North. This is where the political compromises get really wild.
The Army of the North is where you really see how desperate and how diverse this coalition was.
It was the second largest.
Yep, about 120,000 soldiers. And it was a total mashup. You had Swedes, Prussians, Russians, and a bunch of troops from smaller German states.
A truly multinational force. And its commander is the source of all the intrigue.
It is. The commander was Crown Prince Charles John of Sweden. And this is the real aha moment in the whole structure.
Go on.
You might know him better by his original name, Jean-Baptiste Jules Bernadotte.
Wait, Bernadotte? As in Napoleon's Marshal Bernadotte?
The very same, a former marshal of the French Empire. A man Napoleon had made a prince. He was completely entwined with the enemy's system.
So the Allies put a former French marshal in charge of their second largest army to fight France.
I mean, can you imagine the tension, the distrust?
It must have been off the charts. Why would they do that?
It was a political tightrope walk. They needed Sweden in the war, and this was the price. But his loyalty was questioned constantly. He was famously slow and cautious, almost like he was avoiding fighting his old comrades.
I can just picture Blücher losing his mind over that.
Oh, he openly hated it. He despised Bernadotte's maneuvering. Schwarzenberg had to constantly play mediator. But in the end, the calculation was that they needed his 120,000 men to complete the circle.
So they chose military necessity over perfect trust.
They had to. It shows you this wasn't some well-oiled machine. It was this creaking, stressed, unbelievable piece of political engineering that just barely held together.
So recapping this then, the reason they succeeded at Leipzig, it really comes down to managing this incredible complexity.
Absolutely. The success was in the coordination. You have the four main powers: Austria, Prussia, Russia, and Sweden.
And they field four huge, distinct armies: Bohemia, Silesia, the North, and Poland.
All under this layered command. You have the Tsar, Alexander, as a top political boss, keeping the alliance from fracturing.
While the actual military job, the logistics and the timing, that falls to the CNC, Schwarzenberg.
And he had to somehow manage the clashing personalities of his commanders, the aggressive Blücher, the cautious Bennigsen, and the politically complicated Bernadotte.
That fragile coordination is the real blueprint for the victory. It wasn't just about the fighting, it was about managing the egos in the map room.
It was, and that leaves you with a really interesting final thought to mull over.
What's that?
When you look at any coalition in history, how much military speed and efficiency do leaders always have to sacrifice just to keep the political unity? They paid a huge price in delays and arguments just to keep a guy like Bernadotte on board.
Right.
Was that strategic price worth it in the end? Or could they have won even faster without him?
A political and military juggling act of epic proportions. That really is the heart of the story. A huge thank you for joining us on The Deep Dive. We hope you feel thoroughly informed. We'll see you next time.
If you're here, you're looking to get smart fast. Welcome back to The Deep Dive. We take a complex topic, dig through the research, and pull out exactly what you need to know.
And today we are diving into a really pivotal moment in history, the Battle of Leipzig. sometimes called the Battle of the Nations. We're talking October 1813.
That's right. And our sources on this, I mean, the analysis of what happened after that battle, they don't mince words. This wasn't just a loss for Napoleon.
No, not at all.
It was the final crippling blow. So today, our deep dive is to figure out why this one battle caused damage that the sources call profound, and this is the key word, irreversible.
Right. The core idea we're working with from the material is that Leipzig just fundamentally reset the entire strategic map of Europe.
It wasn't just a mistake he could fix later.
No, this was a structural collapse. So we'll look at the immediate military losses, then the strategic shift it forced, and finally how it put him on a direct path to the end of his empire.
Okay, let's jump right in. The immediate blow, October 1813. This battle was, well, it was huge, right? The biggest in Europe before the First World War.
Absolutely enormous, but the damage goes so much deeper than just the raw numbers.
So what was the critical toll beyond just headcount?
Critical is exactly the right word. You know, the casualties were staggering, maybe 70,000 French and Allied troops lost. But the real difference between Leipzig and, say, the disaster in Russia in 1812 was the quality of who was lost.
Ah, okay. So it's not just about losing soldiers, it's about losing which soldiers?
Precisely. After Russia, Napoleon lost a huge army, sure, but a lot of that was to the cold, to starvation. He still had his veteran corps, his experienced marshals, and a vast empire to recruit from.
But Leipzig was different.
Completely different. In the fields around Leipzig, he lost the professional, experienced soldiers that he had spent the last year carefully rebuilding. These were the guys who held the army together.
The irreplaceable NCOs, the junior officers, the ones who could turn a bunch of new recruits into an actual fighting force.
Exactly. And the analysis shows that after this, Napoleon had to rely almost entirely on kids. Young conscripts, the famous Marie-Louise boys.
Rushed to the front with almost no training.
Brave, for sure, but they just didn't have the discipline or the resilience to stand up against the combined armies of Russia, Prussia, and Austria. His military capacity wasn't just reduced, its very foundation was just shattered.
And when you take a hit like that militarily, the political fallout, the geographical fallout, it must have been immediate. You can't hold land without an army.
And that's where that word irreversible really starts to make sense. This battle ended Napoleon's grip on Central Europe, period. He was forced into this massive, chaotic retreat back west.
Back towards France.
Right, behind the Rhine River. And the speed of that withdrawal is what's so fascinating. He had to give up his logistical bases, everything.
So geopolitically, he's just abandoned Germany, Poland.
All of it. Years of conquest, gone in a matter of weeks. And more importantly, he lost the populations and the treasuries that were funding his wars. All of a sudden, the war wasn't in some far-off land.
It was on his doorstep.
It was coming home.
Okay, that perfectly sets up the next phase here, the strategic collapse. Because Leipzig wasn't just losing a battle, it was like a signal flare to everyone that the whole Napoleonic system was cracking.
It was the ultimate moment of vulnerability. Before Leipzig, even when he was losing, Napoleon was this terrifying figure you had to take seriously. After Leipzig, the coalition realized
they called the shots.
They could dictate the terms. And this is where it gets really interesting. This cascade of political failure. You read about his allies abandoning him, but what did that actually look like?
Was it, treason on the battlefield? Or something more calculated?
Overwhelmingly calculated and incredibly fast. The military loss just snapped the bonds of political loyalty. His satellite states in Germany saw the French army get wrecked and realized their own survival meant switching sides now.
Can you give us an example of how that actually played out?
Well, the classic case is Bavaria, a key French ally. Just days before Leipzig was even fully over, Bavaria signed a treaty with Austria.
Wow, that fast.
That fast. They flipped their allegiance. So now the retreating French army had to literally fight its way through territory that was supposed to be friendly just a week earlier.
So not only does he lose his own army, but the path home is suddenly hostile. It just compounds the disaster.
It's the perfect storm. The coalition didn't even have to conquer these places. They just had to wait for them to switch sides. And losing those buffer states gave the coalition a massive, unprecedented advantage.
And the sources are really clear on this point. This failure directly led to the invasion of France in 1814, which was this huge psychological reversal, right? For 20 years, France had been pushing outward.
Now the fight was coming to them. And Napoleon's strategic position was just desperate. He's trying to defend this huge border with a depleted army against a coalition that is unified, confident, and right there.
He didn't just lose soldiers, he lost the ability to make new, effective soldiers fast enough to matter.
Exactly right. His campaigns in 1814 are fundamentally different from anything he'd done before. He's not trying to expand his empire anymore. He's not aiming for Vienna or Berlin.
He's just trying to keep the enemy out of Paris.
It's purely defensive, purely reactive, a complete reversal.
Which brings us to the core of this whole thing. Why was this damage truly irreversible? We all know Napoleon was a military genius. He won some incredible victories in that 1814 campaign in France.
Oh, brilliant victories. The 6 Days campaign is legendary.
So why didn't that tactical brilliance change the outcome?
And that is really the most important question, isn't it? When does strategy just completely overwhelm tactics? Our research shows he was winning battles, but losing the war.
The war of resources.
Of resources, of logistics, of manpower. He could brilliantly outmaneuver a larger force one day, win a stunning victory, but the next day, the coalition could just bring up another 50,000 men. Napoleon couldn't.
He was permanently operating from a deficit, a hole he just couldn't fill.
That is the definition of irreversibility in this context. After 1813, he no longer had access to the men and money from Italy, from Germany, from the Netherlands. He only had France, a France that had been at war for 20 years and was exhausted.
Oh, the coalition had, well, the rest of Europe.
The entire industrial and human capacity of Russia, Austria, Prussia, not to mention Britain's money funding the whole thing. It's a war of attrition where, as you said, one side has a bucket and the other has an ocean.
And tactical genius just can't refill the bucket.
It can't. So even with those amazing tactical wins in 1814, and of course the 100 Days campaign after he escaped from Elba, they were just delaying actions. They couldn't reverse the fundamental strategic math that was set at Leipzig.
It sounds like Leipzig was the moment the debt became too big to ever pay back.
That's it. That's precisely it. The analysis is emphatic. The loss of the veteran army and the loss of Central Europe created a strategic deficit that was, and I quote the source again, irreversible.
So let's connect the dots to the end. How did Leipzig hasten that final chapter?
It just put the clock on a terrifyingly fast countdown. Once the coalition invaded France, which they could only do because of Leipzig Napoleon's political support inside his own country, just melted away.
Which led to his first abdication.
Directly, in April 1814, and then his exile to Elba.
And even when he came back for that amazing 100 Days comeback tour,
he was facing the exact same problem. He was one man with one nation's resources against a fully mobilized and hostile continent. The strategic collapse of 1813 made Waterloo in 1815 almost inevitable, no matter how brilliant he was.
It's a powerful lesson. One massive strategic defeat can make every victory that comes after it totally meaningless.
To sum it all up, Leipzig did 3 things that sealed his fate. 1, it wiped out his experienced military capacity. 2, it forced him out of Central Europe, letting the coalition come right to his border. And 3, those 2 things opened the door for the invasion of France, the collapse of his government, and the end of his empire.
So our deep dive conclusion is pretty clear. Leipzig wasn't just the biggest battle. It was the moment, the mechanism that flipped the switch from imperial expansion to a desperate, doomed defense. It guaranteed that every fight after that was a fight he couldn't ultimately win.
And we'll leave you with a final thought on this, building on that idea of irreversibility. Think about this concept of, let's call it, a critical mass of failure. If one event like Leipzig can lock a genius like Napoleon into an irreversible decline, what does that say about, well, about anything, modern warfare or even corporate strategy?
Does one major strategic wound doom an entire enterprise?
Right. Regardless of how many small wins you pull off afterwards, it suggests that once you cross a certain tipping point of loss, the structure itself just can't support a recovery. And that is a true timeless lesson of Leipzig.